I'm assuming that's your mother.
Hey everybody, welcome to Vox Veritas, Episode 5, Happiness in Neuroscience. This is, thank you for joining us. Hope everyone is having a good break from school. Once again, my name is David Carreon, a psychiatrist and neuroscience researcher at Stanford. Tonight's lecture is the Neuroscience of Happiness, Part 2. If you weren't here live or aren't here live, all lectures are saved on YouTube so you can go at your own pace. As for our announcements this week, for our live audience, feel free to ask questions via YouTube chat, Twitter, or email. I'll try to answer as many as I can at the end of the lecture. For those watching afterwards on YouTube, you can also ask questions in the comment section. Again, the chat rules are simple. Please watch your language, no spam, treat others the way you want to be treated. If you break the rules, you'll get one warning before you're banned. If you want to be unbanned, send me an email next week. All right. So, without further ado,
I'm going to we're going to talk about the neuroscience and happiness. So just to review, we talked about happiness as having these three parts. There's the individual part. There's what you need to be ship-shape in order to achieve these long-term goals. You also need to be able to get along with other ships in the fleet if you want to get to your destination. And finally, of course, to get to a destination, you need to have a destination. And so these are the three elements. And we've been talking about this first element: how to be ship-shape, how to be good in your own ship. And also to review, there's a framework that the NIMH uses, talking about negative valence systems, positive valence systems, social processes, and cognitive systems. So a negative, a plus, an equals, and a question mark. Or in the classical world, courage, temperance, justice, and prudence. All right, so we're going to be talking this week about temperance. Now, who wants to talk about temperance? That sounds like the most boring lecture in the whole world, but bear with me, it's actually pretty cool. In fact, there's some really awesome neuroscience research in this domain that's super interesting. All right, so the big question for us today is more pleasure always good? And of course, almost everybody says, "Oh, of course, we want more pleasure. Good thing, a little bit's good. Why not more?" So the answer to this considers pleasure like this. And if we think of something that's enjoyable on the x-axis and pleasure on the y-axis, the goal is how do we get the most amount? And that is to move to this place right here. We want to go to have just enough of this thing so that we have as much pleasure as possible. And whether this is food or drink, whatever it is, wanting to maximize the amount of pleasure that we get overall, because if you add more of this thing, the actual happiness or enjoyment goes down. So we're going to go back to some classic science, some classic psychology. This guy with the totally awesome beard, his name was Ivan Pavlov. And he had this really cool experiment where he would expose dogs to meat. And what happens when dogs smell meat? Oh, their mouth slobbers all over the place. If you've ever had a big dog, you know how slobbery dogs can be, extremely slobbery. And so he would have research assistants actually put a bucket under the dog's mouth and catch the slobber, and then measure the amount of slobber that the dogs put off. I mean, there's a lot of lab jobs I'd like to have in history. That is not one of them. So what he did was he paired, every time he gave the dog a steak or meat, he would ring the bell. He would ring that bell, and then after that, give them the meat. And before long, he got them to start slobbering just by having the bell ring. Now, this is really interesting because normally, dogs don't encounter brass bells in the wild, but they're able to learn that the brass bell meant that food was coming, and then their whole physiology changed, that they were able to actually cause slobber to start developing while they were going through this, just in response to this brass bell. And it's a really astonishing feature of mammalian experience. And when we talk about pleasure, we're talking about a system deep in the brain, and one of the most important parts is the nucleus accumbens. This part in red, deep in the middle of the brain. And so you think about something that you like, something that's good, like chocolate, for example. Chocolate, delicious. And so if you think about chocolate, there's different things. If you have a piece of chocolate in your hand, there is the aspect of it that asks that of the actual enjoyment of it versus the actual the wanting the chocolate, sort of having this motivation to eat the chocolate, which is separate from the actual enjoyment of the chocolate itself. And so there's two different systems in the brain that work on this. The I want is the dopamine system, and the I like, the actual so-called hedonic experience, is often mediated by the opiate system. And so these two systems work together in conjunction for this full-bodied experience of a full-bodied experience of a pleasurable experience. And so when you think about, and they did a lot of experiments on rats and laboratory animals, and what they'll do is they'll connect all variety of things into their brains. So in one experiment, they connected into the brains of these rats an electrode, and the electrode they put into the brain in a certain spot, looking for a fear center. And the guys that originally did this weren't very good at neuroanatomy, and they were shocking, expecting the rat to be afraid every time they gave that shock. But what they found was the rat wasn't afraid. The rat seemed to want more of that shock. They inadvertently discovered this center, this nucleus accumbens, that every time the rat got this stimulation, there was this pleasurable experience, or at least this positive motivation to go after this more stimulation. And the rats got completely addicted to brain stimulation, to the point that even to the point of not eating or drinking, that they'll continue to press on this lever until they pass out from exhaustion. It's incredible how strong this effect is. Now, here's another experiment they did, and the y-axis on all these graphs is the amount of dopamine in the brains of the rat. And in this rat over here, this is a rat. The top rat is one teetotaler rat that never had any exposure to alcohol at all. Social drinker rat is somebody who had some exposure to alcohol but was not addicted. And then this last one is the alcoholic rat. And this first red line is when the scientists stopped access to alcohol. And what happens to the teetotaler? Nothing. Teetotaler didn't have alcohol before, didn't have alcohol after. Everything is just fine. What about the social drinker? Social drinker also just fine. No difference in the amount of dopamine signaling between before and after the amount of after the alcohol has been cut off. But the alcoholic, the one that is dependent on it, what happens? He's at this level of dopamine and drops off pretty significantly. He is not feeling good when he doesn't have alcohol. And then over here they reintroduce the alcohol, and what happens? The alcoholic is able to get back up to normal. What happens when the social drinker gets back access to alcohol? He has he goes above his baseline. He gets above normal. And of course the teetotaler doesn't get any alcohol at all. So you see that sometimes people who are addicted to alcohol or a substance will say that they don't drink to feel good, they drink to feel normal. And this is reflecting, or at least this correlates with, a state of dopamine in the brain. So people can be reduced to some pretty low levels. This is a woman injecting heroin into one of her last remaining veins. It's a process, an experience that's very it takes control of the person and takes control of the organism, and really is very difficult to overcome. And so I think the power by which we overcome it, the power by which we overcome positive temptations, classically is called temperance. The ability to take just the right amount of pleasurable stimulus. This is a classic experiment done by a guy named Walter Mischel at Stanford. So this is actually a reproduction of it. But what he did was had children sit in a room, and if gave them put one marshmallow in front of them and said, you could either have this one marshmallow now or wait until I come back and then you get 2 marshmallows. Now, from an investment standpoint, this is 100% return on investment, and they had to wait 15 minutes. So that is a phenomenal return. That is an absolutely astonishingly good return. You couldn't hope to do any better than 100% return. Now, if you happen to be a child, though, this is very, very difficult. And so they, and you'll see these children had just incredibly difficult times trying to resist not eating the marshmallow. But what they found was that they looked at this initially and made some observations, published a paper, but then they started looking back and found that these kids, the kids who were able to do good on the marshmallow, had much better lives all around. So in fact, it was Walter Mischel's daughter who actually pointed out, hey, Dad, the kids in school that are making trouble were the kids that ate the marshmallow immediately. And so they started looking at these kids and they started thinking maybe this was a predictive task. Maybe this is something that would predict and show how well people did in other domains. And sure enough, in almost every domain, in health, in income, and how much money people make, and their probability of getting in trouble or getting in trouble with the law, in their relationships, all of these things were affected, were correlated with how long they waited for that marshmallow when they were young. So in terms of even their weight, their adult weight, so there's about a 3-point body mass index point. So it goes from looking like this to looking like this, or this to this, or and the men's side here to here or here to here. So for women, that's about a 20-pound weight difference for an average sized woman. So we're talking pretty significant differences in adult income, pretty significant differences in adult health. So this is a huge change predicted by a simple little experiment that you could do when you're a child. Now, what part of the brain is involved in this? Now, here we get to one of my very favorite parts of the brain, one of the parts of the brain that I actually study, the inferior frontal gyrus. Okay, so here's our brain. And so you to navigate, you find the central sulcus, which is this one right here. You pop ahead, you go to the bottom of this one, you pop ahead, and then right there is the right inferior frontal gyrus. And so if you look at this, they found that the kids 40 years later, after they'd grown up, kids who were able to resist the marshmallow had more activity in the inferior frontal gyrus, this part that's red in the bottom right, than the kids that didn't. So the very same kids that did this experiment, they were able to track down 40 years later. This is a very unusual thing to be able to do with neuroscience, but they did it. And so there's another set of people that has been able to, that is an interesting test case. Those are people who are methamphetamine addicts. And for there's a show on TV that probably none of you are allowed to watch called Breaking Bad, that is all about methamphetamine production. And so this is it's crystal methamphetamine. It's a drug that is a stimulant that is quite addictive. And so what they did was they looked at the brains of these various people who and a large number of people who were using methamphetamines, and they tried to identify what's different about their brains. And so they found 2 different things. So the one over here is a result of a study where they looked at the gray matter, the parts of the brain that's actually doing where the neurons lie, that's doing the firing, that's doing the processing. There's more gray matter in the people who have less cravings. So the people who have the strongest cravings kind of have weak, flabby inferior frontal gyri. And the same thing with the connections, the wires connecting the inferior frontal gyrus to the rest of the brain, the white matter. Over here, this experiment shows that there's a reduction in white matter in that same area for people who have habitually neglected or have failed to have self-control over this this drug use. Now, in partial support of the idea that there's a biological or heritable component, they found that in the white matter study, the one where the wires connecting, there was a difference in the brain with the siblings of the drug users who themselves didn't use drugs. Now, this is interesting for two reasons. First of all, because there's a propensity to use drugs. That if you have this bad brain, it suggests that you're more at risk for falling into drug use. But the other interesting piece of it is that it is an unaddicted sibling. Even though the brain looks the same, even though their response on some of these tests is the same, one of the siblings is addicted and the other sibling isn't addicted. So drug addiction is a highly interesting, very complex field. So on a more practical level, how do we build willpower? How do we build self-control? And there's various experiments they've done to try to measure these. And we talked a little bit about this in practical neuroscience. But one of the ways that you can build self-control and build willpower is through exercise. Physical exercise is a phenomenal way to build self-control. And we talked a little bit about that in the last week also, that when you overcome painful pain, it seems that this requires the brain to work together. And maybe in part, that's what willpower is being able to have the brain work together towards a goal against difficulty. But what's another difficult thing? Using proper language is also difficult. So they had one group of people use language however they liked, and another group of people make sure that they avoid saying certain words. So using contractions like is rather than saying is not, they needed to say is not rather than isn't. And so and they needed to avoid profanity. So the people who had to constantly be monitoring their language, those people did a worse job. The people who had to monitor their language constantly had better willpower at the end of this several-week experiment. They also tried having people sit up straight, so good posture. So sitting up straight in your chair, that's another way that you can, that the people at the end of that experiment had more willpower. Using the left hand instead of the right hand, people who did that had more willpower. And finally, meditation. Also, you have more willpower if you practice meditation. And as we talked about before, it's a lot of it has to do with focusing your attention, refocusing your attention in a particular direction. And when you do that repeatedly, whether it be with your left hand, using your left hand instead of your right, sitting up straight, not using profanity, exercising even though it's difficult, when you have to do these things that are difficult, this seems to be the kind of activity that builds willpower. All right. So this is the so we've talked. I'm gonna introduce the next topic, and we won't go into we won't finish it, but we'll just start with the next one. So we've been talking previously about these about the individual ethics, the individual virtue, and so now we're going to move into virtue of a group. And so in order to talk about this is the virtue of justice, giving and the classical conception was sort of giving to everyone what's due to them. And so we're going to back up and talk a little bit about some more classic experiments. This is a photograph of a monkey clinging to a cloth mother. So this is an experiment done by a guy named Harry Harlow. And back in the day, there was this thought that sterile environments would be best for children. If we were able to control the inputs and outputs and make sure that all of these squishy and unmeasurable things like maternal love and hugs, this is not something that's scientific. And so there was a gradual trend towards keeping babies away from this maternal unpredictability. But what Harry Harlow discovered was that when you separate a monkey from something soft, particularly something that feels like a hug, the monkeys don't do very well. They fail to thrive. They don't develop properly, and in fact, some of them even die. And so what he found was that when he put monkeys, given the option to have one of them that was a cage but gave nutrition versus soft but didn't give nutrition, the monkeys would spend almost all of their time clinging to this one over here, the soft one. And so this is partly driven by the monkey's ability to driven by this particular hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone that's responsible for letting down milk that helps mammals to connect with their young in that way. And we used to think that was all that it was, as this maternal hormone. But it's become much more popular recently, so much so that some people have tattooed it on their foot. And one of the classic experiments showing other dimensions by which this can reach out to other people, that oxytocin is bigger than just the maternal hormone, is with prairie voles. And so there's a particular species of mammal, a small animal called a vole. And for prairie voles are a kind of animal that are monogamous. So when the male prairie vole, the daddy prairie vole, is a faithful husband, he will, after mating, he will stick with his partner for life. Isn't that adorable? And his cousin, the montane vole, after mating, takes off. Not at all faithful, just kind of a player. Now, what they did was they blocked the oxytocin receptors of the prairie vole, and the prairie vole started behaving like the montane vole. That by blocking this set of receptors, he started behaving in a way that was opposite to his normal nature. And on the other hand, when this guy was given oxytocin receptors, he started to behave like this one, like the prairie vole. He started being monogamous. So it's a huge part of human bonding, in this case pair bonding, but we're discovering more and more that it's not just pair bonding, but it's much broader than that. This is Paul Zak, and he did an experiment. He was invited to actually take blood samples from a reporter's wedding. This particular person invited him to her wedding to take blood samples of her and her husband and all of these people, and then watched as they progressed throughout this wedding ceremony. There was a huge release in oxytocin between these two, but not just the bride and groom. Everyone around got this release of oxytocin. So we're beginning to think that it's a hormone that's responsible for bonding together of humans in general. So that is that's the end of the lecture portion right now. We're going to go on to the questions today. So question number 1: how much alcohol does it take to make an alcoholic rat? Not that much. It's not a whole heck of a lot of alcohol. Generally, they dose it by weight equivalents, so grams of alcohol per weight of the animal. And the rats are pretty small, so you don't need a whole lot of alcohol to get a rat drunk. Number 2: do all types of addiction affect the brain in the same way, or are things like alcohol and cocaine addiction different? It's an excellent question. I think that this is one of the areas of hot research. We don't know for sure. There's certainly special things and areas that are different and peculiar to individual drugs. Certainly in the acute intoxication phase, they affect in different ways. But there is a thought that there's a common neurocircuitry to addiction, and a lot of it has to do with the pleasure response, and as well as the addiction, the inferior frontal gyrus, amongst other places. Addiction is kind of complicated. It's kind of a whole brain thing. Question number 3: Tourette's is equal to so there's a syndrome called Tourette's syndrome, and that's a lot of swearing. How is their willpower, and can they improve their willpower, their IFG, by practicing not swearing? It's an excellent question. I think Tourette's syndrome, I don't know the specifics about the Tourette's syndrome neuroimaging in particular. The difficulty with diseases that are more uncommon is that we don't usually have as many neuroimaging studies about them. And I think that with Tourette's, it's kind of in the axis of a tick, automatic behaviors. That's not so much. That's more like a hiccup than it is an addiction, and so it's difficult. It's not exactly a failure of willpower per se, in the same way of some of these others. In fact, it's even controversial to say that some of these other things are failures of willpower, at least at the terminal stages. That is to say, at the level we call it an addiction, are we still talking about willpower? In this same paradigm. Certainly, when a person who's not having an addiction eats too much or drinks too much or something like that, we can call it that. But does the brain get into some other kind of state later on? It's a good question, and certainly the answer is in some way yes. Question number 4: if oxytocin can make voles nicer, does it work in humans? Are there experiments that tried to make humans nicer by giving them oxytocin? So the answer to the last question is yes, absolutely. Oxytocin research is absolutely going bananas right now. Everybody is giving oxytocin to everyone for everything, and it's kind of ridiculous how excited we are about oxytocin. Unfortunately, the difficult part of oxytocin administration is that you kind of have to get it into your brain specifically because it's kind of big and doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier very well, and so you kind of have to give it in a nasal spray up your nose, and it's kind of annoying. But that nonetheless, people are trying it, and so far there's not profound effects to the extent that it's been approved as a therapy yet. But people are actually thinking about using it, and particularly for conditions where social connection is impaired. So conditions like autism, there's some excitement about oxytocin pathways being excited. Now, of course, other people say that's way too simple. That's not going to be the solution to autism, and it remains to be seen how good this research will play out. And I think the other thing to note is that does oxytocin make us nicer? It makes us more likely to make bonds and to bond together. And I think that's not the fullness of the human good. That's not the fullness of the human experience. And I think that just being nice isn't going to lead to a flourishing society or even a flourishing life. That sometimes you need to be tough, you need to be strong, and just being nice all the time isn't a balanced life. And I think that one of the themes that's going to recur in this program is that the balance of these different virtues is really the key. It's not that there's one thing that you could just sort of press the pedal to the metal and go all the way for. It's really a balancing game, and finding out what is the right response, what is the appropriate response in this situation. So there's one more question. Is there any theory for alcoholics that's more successful than AA? This is also a very good question, an area of active research, and so I think there's a number of theories about how to approach addiction, though I think that none has a better long-term track record than AA. The difficulty with AA is we don't really know how well it works because it's anonymous. That's kind of the trouble with doing good statistics on it. But nonetheless, it does seem to be one of the more successful things that we do, and we do recommend people go to groups, and there are groups, and they do seem to be helpful. But how helpful and compared to what is always the question. Sort of medical models work for a short time, but certainly this long-term community, continuing to go to groups, seems to be very helpful for a lot of people moving forward out of addiction. But there is a trend more recently towards something called harm reduction, where they don't mandate abstinence. That's growing. That's gaining traction recently. But it remains to be seen if that model is going to be better than AA, and if it is, how would we know? So these are all excellent questions, and you guys keep on asking questions and stay curious. So thank you very much for joining us again for another episode of Vox Veritas. If you're interested in these topics, please let us know. We do love feedback. Once again, we're live every Sunday at 8:28 p.m. Next Sunday, 12/28/14, we will continue with the Neuroscience of Happiness Part 3. If you're interested, please tell your friends, and thanks again, and we will see you next week. Happy holidays.